And we're good. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Skype a Scientist Live. My name is Sarah McAnulty, and I am the executive director of Skype a Scientist. And today we are super excited to have a marine biologist, somebody who knows a lot about all the cool animals who live in the ocean and even the parasites that live in the ocean, which is going to be super fun to talk about. Jimmy. That's really all the housekeeping we have today. Jimmy, do you want to tell us who you are, what you do, and why you like it?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. So like Sarah said, my name's Jimmy Bernot. I'm 31 years old and I live in Washington, D.C., but I was born in New Jersey, so probably not that far from where Sarah is now. And I'm a marine biologist that works at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in D.C. So right now I pretty much do research full time. I got my PhD in December, which for those of you that don't know, that's like an additional degree you could do after college, takes like 5 or 6 years. So I just finished school when I was 30 years old. I didn't like school very much when I was very young, but the longer I stayed in school, the more I liked it. And so my grandma always jokes with me that at first she couldn't get me to go to school, and then for a while she couldn't get me to leave. So what do? I study different animals in the world. I try to figure out how they work, like how they make their living. And I'm especially interested in the small animals that we often overlook, like small invertebrates, particularly those that live in the ocean. And when most of us think about animals, we might picture in our head like a mammal of some sort, maybe a dog, a cat, or a whale. But actually, more than 95% of animal diversity is small invertebrates. But because we're kind of big, we tend to kind of overlook these really important small animals. So I identify species and describe new species if I find ones that are new. And I've described about 10 new species. And I also build family trees for species. So you might have built like a family tree with your parents and siblings and cousins and grandparents. I try to do that, but for different species. So a much bigger tree with much, more distantly related things. And because there's so many different animals out there, you can't really be a specialist on all sorts of animals. There's millions and millions of species. So I specialize on crustaceans, which we might be familiar with some of them because humans eat a lot of them. So things like crabs, shrimp, and lobsters, but also other ones that we don't eat, like barnacles or isopods, which are like roly-polies that you might find in your yard. Or in the ocean, there's actually a lot more isopods. So I'll show you one that I have now, which is a deep sea isopod. I actually bought these on Twitter, of all places. And I got 3 of these big isopods from about a few hundred meters, almost a kilometer below the ocean surface. But my all-time favorite group of animals are called copepods. They are small crustaceans. You can think of them like tiny shrimp, about the size of a grain of rice or a sesame seed. And I'll show you some pictures and some specimens in little jars in a minute. So I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Let's see if this works. I just reinstalled my operating system, so I actually have to like enable the Zoom app, and hopefully I don't have to restart to do that. And if I do, I'll probably just skip the images, unfortunately. Let's see. Will not be able to record the contents of your screen until I quit. Okay, well, probably rather than quit, I'll just skip the images. Sorry about that, folks. I wanted to tell you that if you've never heard of a copepod, you're not alone. But those of you that have watched SpongeBob SquarePants are actually familiar with a copepod because the character Plankton is clearly modeled after a copepod. Copepods are these small little crustaceans with little antennae, kind of like an insect, and Plankton has those. Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. And they also have copepods have a single like cyclops eye in the middle of their forehead, which is also kind of what Plankton from SpongeBob looks like. And copepods are super numerous, very abundant in the plankton. So just a bucket of seawater could have hundreds or thousands of small copepods in it. They're also really important. They're some of the most abundant animals on the planet. They're probably the most numerous animal in the ocean. So if you counted up all the individuals of all animals in the ocean, copepods would be at the top of that list. And they're important because they link microscopic food webs with macroscopic food webs. So they're just the right size to eat really tiny things, but then be eaten by bigger things. And they're really cool. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. So I'll probably leave that as my little intro, and I'll let you all steer the discussion with your questions.
Awesome. So if anybody has questions about all the cool things that live in the ocean, particularly copepods or parasites or crustaceans or any of that, please put it in the Q&A now. We've got a question from Brielle. What is your favorite animal? And what do you think of if someone says the word animal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I'll answer the second part first, I think. When somebody says animal, I probably picture something very different from most people. So I actually picture something like an arthropod, maybe an insect, when somebody says animal, because actually in terms of the number of species, arthropods are the king. If an alien came to planet Earth and randomly sampled a bunch of animals, most of them would be arthropods and most of those would be insects. So in terms of like numbers of species, the arthropods have really dominated our planet for hundreds of millions of years. What is my favorite? It's hard to pick one. One of my favorites, though, is a parasitic copepod that lives in sea urchins, which is kind of weird. And what's even weirder about it is, well, it lives in the esophagus of sea urchins, so that's already strange. And its relatives are all parasites of fish. So we know that sometime in distant evolutionary history, these copepods switched from living on the gills of fish to living inside of a sea urchin, which is really crazy when you think about it. And some people think that maybe fish that were eating sea urchins or hiding in sea urchins kind of transferred these copepods to them millions of years ago. We still don't know for sure how that happened, but we know they got there somehow from fish. So that's a pretty cool story.
That's super cool. Let's see, the next question, and this may come from, I don't know how much science TikTok you've been watching, but there's this really common, not common, but like popular dude on TikTok that finds little animals living like inside the sides of shrimp, like right under their shells.
Yes.
And so this person asks, have you seen parasites inside of shrimp that are sucking blood?
Yeah, so these are a group of parasitic isopods, which are like related to the pill bugs you might find on land or these big ones that you might find in the ocean. But the ones on land and most of the ones in the ocean are free living. They're kind of like scavengers. But there are some that are parasites, including these ones that live on the gills of crustaceans, and they're called bopyrids. And they're very interesting. They're weird because their bodies are very asymmetrical. Since they live on one side of a crustacean, they kind of are bent to fit on just that side, which is kind of weird. And they are actually known from even fossils because they cause the crustacean's shell to like bulge out on the side, that we know that there's, all these fossil crabs and shrimp, and sometimes they'll fossilize with a big kind of lump on their side, which is probably one of these isopods living on it when it died and fossilized.
Wild. Awesome. Amanda asks, are copepods important to coral reef systems? How and why?
Great question. And yes, they are very important. They're important because, like I said, they're so abundant in the plankton that corals, they photosynthesize. Some of them, they get energy from the sun, but they also look kind of like small little anemones living together. They have tentacles that they catch stuff with, and they eat like an anemone kind of does. And so corals actually eat a lot of copepods, and copepods are providing a lot of the food that corals don't make from the sun, but catch out in the water. There are also some copepods that live just on corals. They may be parasites of the corals, or they may just be kind of hiding on the surface of the corals. So there's a lot of interaction there between corals and copepods.
Cool. Mrs. Young's fourth and fifth grade class, this is from Rayanne, wants to know, how did plankton numbers become so huge? And we'll start there.
Yeah, well, first it's that the ocean is so big, right? If we look at a picture of a globe, and now I'm really sorry that I didn't, enable screen sharing before, most of what we see is blue stuff. It's open ocean. So like 70% of the surface of the planet is ocean, and actually more than 98% of the livable space on the world is ocean. That might not make sense at first, but it's because on land, we're kind of running around on a flat surface. Maybe there's like mountains we could climb, but we can't like fly up into the air and live in the whole atmosphere. But in the ocean, animals do. So you can have, one little patch of ocean has some animals living on the very surface, and then that ocean is miles deep, and there are all sorts of animals living along that whole depth. So there's just a lot of space for copepods in the ocean, and they are pretty small. So they can be very numerous, and they basically follow the plankton, the phytoplankton, the small microscopic plants around. And when those plants bloom in large numbers and reproduce a lot, the copepods do the same thing. So the more food they have, the more eggs they lay, and they follow the plankton and kind of create big populations when the plankton does.
Awesome, thanks. So you've been showing us that cool isopod that you have in a jar, and you said that you got it off Twitter. Like, where was it found? How was it caught? Like, how did this all come to be?
Yeah, so I know a guy that I reached out to somebody who posted a picture of sharks that had copepods on them, because they do some like shark jaw restorations for museums or for fishermen or collectors. And so somebody had sent them a dead shark, and it had all these copepods on it that they thought was interesting. And I wrote them saying, hey, can you send me some of those? And they were very nice and did that. And a few months later, they said a friend of theirs got some of these big isopods from the deep sea. And it might have been, I'm not exactly sure how, it might have been in like a deep crab trap or something that pulled these up from almost 1,000 meters or a kilometer below the surface off the coast of Australia. And there were 3 isopods in there, probably that were already dead, or maybe that died on the way up because some of their legs were broken off and they're not in like perfect shape. But anyway, they're really cool. And I sent him a direct message on Twitter saying, he was saying I might sell these things. And I was like, I would totally buy those. And I thought I wouldn't be able to afford it, but it actually was a pretty good price. So I ordered 3 isopods because it was the middle of the lockdown, and why not?
We all needed something to jazz up this year. I've also done some goofy purchases myself. My entire like living room right now is just pots where I'm growing milkweed to try to prepare for all the butterflies. So like, yeah.
Awesome.
Our own hobbies during.
Yeah, I have a little plant collection back here too.
Very nice. Gavin wants to know, do you ever scuba dive for your research?
I'm actually really embarrassed to say I am not scuba certified. I should get scuba certified at some point. But I typically I can snorkel and collect things in shallow water, just free diving, or actually most of the time I work with fishermen because they are really the best people in the world at catching fish. They make their livelihood from it. So I've gone to a few places like Chile where we tried to catch our own fish, and we would get like, 5 or 10 a day. And if we worked with the fishermen coming into the docks, they catch, hundreds or thousands. And we would say, oh, if you have any bycatch, these things that you're not interested in selling are probably already dead or pretty beat up from being hooked or caught in a net. Can you keep those for us? And they often oblige. And we've even named a few new species after the fishermen that have helped give us their hosts. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, fishermen help. So I'm a squid biologist, and fishermen have helped us too. Like we went to Japan for field work, and we caught about 25% of our own squid that fishermen just would not care about because they're like meat this big.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the squid we got were just at fish markets because they're way, just like you said, they're better at it than we are. And so we got to work together. That's
Yeah.
great. Let's see. Mrs. Tobin's fifth grade class wants to know, do you have any pets?
I don't have any pets here. I have a boyfriend and he has a dog. So
All right, all
I
right.
take care of the dog quite a bit, and I love all sorts of animals. Growing up, I had everything as pets. Pet rats, I think, are fantastic. I had gerbils too, a guinea pig, a turtle. I had a giant African millipede as a pet. This was a millipede that was like over a foot long. My mother was horrified when my dad and I brought it home. We had gotten it at a Rutgers ag field day. There was like a bug show there, and we came home with this giant millipede, and my mom was like, what? But it was a great pet. I just gave it vegetables that were like kind of starting to go bad. Yeah.
That's a solid pet. That's
Yeah,
really
in
cool.
high school, I even kept sea monkeys in my locker.
In your locker.
Yeah, I got like one of those little things that had a little light on it, and that was like my funny goofy thing to have in there, but it would also like cheer me up when I walked to my locker.
That's awesome. That's when you know you're in the right field, when you have stories like, well, there was that time I kept sea monkeys in my locker.
The funny thing is, well, sea monkeys are crustaceans, but I actually, back then, my favorite animals were probably salamanders or maybe snakes. And so I was kind of thinking that, when I was in college and I thought I might want to do research, I first thought about doing research on those animals. And then I met this fantastic female professor named Janine Kyra, and she was so passionate and excited about these tapeworms and sharks and how they were testing different theories about biogeography, and do sharks swim across deep sea trenches, and you could tell this by their parasites. So I thought, that's kind of weird, but I'll try it out. And I ended up loving it and working with her for 5 years. And then I kind of switched to copepods for my PhD, and I'm continuing to work on copepods now.
So did you go to undergrad at UConn?
I did my undergrad and master's at UConn. Yeah.
Oh my God. So I got my
PhD. I think we may have seen each other in passing like once, but I know we didn't have a class or anything together. But when I left UConn and I saw you were starting up all of this stuff, I was like, oh, that is so cool.
Wow. Small world. Okay. So Mrs. Tobin's fifth grade class also wants to know, when you're going out into the field, how do you find the sea creatures, like just out in this big wide open world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I often work with like computational biologists, people that use computers and kind of computer science to analyze data. And it's really funny when I talk to them, because I'm like, well, it's really hard to get these specimens. And they're like, what do you mean? Because they're used to living in a very different world where data is very accessible. And there's some really practical challenges of trying to collect copepods from, say, hydrothermal vents that could be a few miles below the surface. So there's a few ways people collect them. For the non-parasitic ones, we'll typically use a plankton net, which is just like a long funnel-shaped net that has really, really fine mesh. You can't even really see the holes in it because you're catching things so small with it. You could drag those through the water and catch the free-living copepods swimming in the plankton that way. For the parasites, you have to collect their hosts. So like I said, for fish, we often work with fishermen to collect them. For the ones that live in sea urchins, I would just free dive for those and pick them up with my hands. I bought a pair of Kevlar gloves because some of them were stabbing me through my gloves. And actually, they even could poke me through the Kevlar gloves sometimes.
Oh my God.
Yeah. That's a type of urchin called diadema, which is like these crazy spines. Yeah, so those were a little tricky. We actually started using like barbecue tongs to collect those. It was perfect. Yeah, so it really depends on what you want to look at. And it's sometimes hard because these copepods live on everything. All sorts of animals have different copepods. All sorts of animals in the ocean, I should say, have different copepods living on them. So you can be overwhelmed sometimes when you go to a new place and you're like, well, do I look at the sea squirts, or do I look at the fish, or do I try to look at the corals or the bivalves? And that's pretty hard. And it's one of the reasons that people have tended to focus on the ones that live on fish, because people collect fish a lot more and it's easier to find those copepods.
For sure. Cool. Nicholas wants to know, how big can an arthropod get?
Good question. So the largest ones in terms of like measuring their size are Japanese giant spider crabs. Their legs can be like 8 feet across, really, really big, but their body is actually kind of small. Their body might only be about this big, a little bit bigger than my head, but they have these really long legs. The heaviest arthropod is probably the American lobster, which can get to be like 80 pounds. So lobsters actually never stop growing. They just keep molting and growing larger. So the older lobster, a very, very old lobster could get very, very big.
For sure. I think the main fishery, if they find a lobster that's a certain bigness, size, they put it back because those are the ones that are like really doing the
Exactly. Yeah. And so unfortunately, we've eaten a lot of the big lobsters, although I hear even the giant lobsters don't taste as good as the smaller ones anyway.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, and like Sarah said, the bigger they are, usually the more eggs they can produce if they're female. And so it's actually really important to leave the big ones there. They're some of the most important ones in terms of the population. Even though we often regulate things by saying it has to be over this side, it might biologically be better in some cases to say, if it's under this side, it's okay to catch them. And we should leave the bigger things that are really on, doing most of the population work.
For sure. Yeah. Fisheries management is so complicated and challenging. So
yeah,
if you're interested in fisheries, go into it because we need lots of people working on this stuff. For sure.
Absolutely.
Mrs. Young's 4th and 5th grade class also wants to know, what is it about plankton that categorizes some of them as parasitic? Are they causing harm? Do any of them help? And are all copepods parasitic?
Great question. Okay, so there are 14,000 species of copepods, which is a lot. In comparison, there's about 6,000 species of mammals, or about 9,000 species of birds. So if you add it up, like all the birds and mammals, that's about how many numbers of species there are of copepods. They aren't all parasitic, probably like they're about half and half. So there's about 6,000 species of parasites, and the others are free living, and they tend to be like predators or small herbivores that kind of filter feed through the water and pick up small algae to eat. I think there was another question in there that I might have missed.
Are all copepods parasitic?
Oh, yeah. And then, so, yep, only like about half of them are parasitic. And then what do they do to their hosts? Well, parasites, kind of by the definition of parasitism, harm their host. A parasite is an organism that lives in and on another organism that has some sort of nutritional dependency on its host, and at the host's expense. So they're basically a parasite is taking food from a host some way. It could be kind of directly stealing food, or it could be like drinking the host's blood and getting nutrients that way. But, those all meet the qualifications of being a parasite. There are also a lot of copepods that are something we call commensals, which are animals that gain a benefit from being on another animal, but don't have any harm. So that could be like the relationship between a bird and the tree it builds its nest in. The bird gets an advantage, but the tree isn't harmed. And there are a lot of crustaceans like that. A barnacle growing on a whale, for instance, would be a commensal. The barnacle gets an advantage. It is carried around through the plankton, but the whale, might have an itchy spot on it, but is not really suffering from that barnacle being there.
Yeah, and if folks at home, if you've never looked up whale lice, look up whale lice. It will blow your mind.
And those probably are parasitic. It's kind of unclear, but it looks like they're at least like irritating the skin and possibly feeding on the skin. Yeah. So that would be then causing harm to the host. And so we would call those whale lice parasites. And those are another group of crustaceans, not copepods, but another group of them called amphipods.
Yeah. Whenever I see whales, I just want to pick them all off.
Yeah.
So it's that I just want to scratch the whale for it. I feel like it goes on my face. All right. Malonka is from South Jersey. She says, we used to see a lot of horseshoe crabs. What's their classification?
Great question. Horseshoe crabs are one of my favorite animals. They are arthropods. Arthropods are all animals that have these like jointed, segmented appendages. And so if you flip over a horseshoe crab, you could see it kind of has legs like a crab or an insect does, but quite a bit bigger because they can get pretty large. So those are arthropods, but they are most closely related. They are chelicerates. That's the group they belong to. And they're most closely related to things like arachnids, so spiders and scorpions and ticks all fall, and mites all fall into that group of the chelicerates, and horseshoe crabs are part of that group. I grew up in New Jersey. I used to see them occasionally. And last year, kind of right around the lockdown, since I live in Washington, D.C., I was cooped up in my house all the time. I decided to drive to Delaware Bay on a night of the full moon, and I did see them spawning in mass. You couldn't walk at the shoreline. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, especially because if you think about it, horseshoe crabs have probably been doing that for 350 million years. So before there were even dinosaurs, there were horseshoe crabs crawling on the ocean at full moons to mate and have their babies. Before there was even an Atlantic Ocean, like when the continents were in Pangea, there were horseshoe crabs laying eggs on the shores of the ocean. So it's really amazing when you think about that. When you see it, you're witnessing this ancient evolutionary history.
That honestly makes me tear up a little bit just to think about.
Yeah, it really is amazing. Yeah.
Happening so close to us.
There's an amazing book by Rachel Carson, who's a fantastic science writer and scientist, called The Sea Around Us. And it has some inaccuracies in the beginning because they didn't really know about plate tectonics and everything. It was written a while ago. But she has stories that have really stuck with me, talking about, when you see horseshoe crabs spawning or when you see salmon migrating, you're witnessing something that is like almost eternal compared to the lifespan of a human. These things have been happening, these animal migrations for hundreds of millions of years, and it's pretty amazing to see them.
That's amazing. To change the subject a bit, Eduardo asks, have you seen the parasite that eats a fish's tongue?
Yes. And I recently worked with somebody from Snopes to write an article about those. They used my photograph. So I collected one of these when I was working in Australia in the mouth of a fish. I opened the fish's mouth and like, there it was. We were working with a person that specializes on isopods too. So we had all heard about these and weren't so surprised to find it, but it was I was still surprised. I knew they existed, but I was looking for microscopic copepods on the fish. And when I opened its mouth, there was an isopod about this big. I actually have one. So let me go to my closet and get one.
Great. In the meantime, Gavin asked a question, can copepods or crustaceans use bioluminescence? The answer is absolutely, not all of them, but a lot of them do.
So before I forget, it's going to be a little hard to see in here, but there is like a small white isopod behind the label. I know it's not so easy to see, maybe about 3/4 of an inch long, that was in the mouth of a fish. So yes, they get into the mouth of a fish. They're parasites, and they probably feed on fish blood, but they have really strong claws. So when their legs like pinch onto the tongue, it damages the tongue. And over time, either because they're feeding on it or because their legs are pinching it so hard, most of the tongue degrades and the parasite, the isopod, lives there. And we can actually tell that the fish are kind of using the isopod as a tongue because the back of the isopod will often have scratches on it. Some fish have teeth on the roof of their mouth. And so if they're moving this isopod against their teeth like they would their tongue, the back of the isopod gets scratched.
That's cool. That's very cool. The Cayman International School has a question from Gabe. Gabe wants to know, if you accidentally drink some seawater, are you also accidentally eating copepods?
Probably. I mean, they're so numerous that a cup of seawater will probably have a few dozen swimming around in it. And I should say they're also found in fresh water. There's about 3,000 species found in freshwater, but they aren't as dominant in the freshwater plankton, where there's a lot of other things like ostracods and daphnia swimming around in freshwater. But in the ocean, really, the copepods are like if you took a cup of seawater, counted everything in it, copepods would be the first thing on your list.
Very cool. From Scott Armstrong, their class is learning about natural resources and they're learning about the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, and how that ecosystem is recovering after the cod collapse that occurred all over the eastern seaboard, and wanted to know how plankton might play into that ecosystem.
Wow, that is an excellent question. The short answer of it is I don't know for sure. I think what's going on there is a really complicated mix of things. I mean, we were catching a lot of cod. We were also harvesting a lot of their food sources like lobsters and other animals that cod eat. So we're really putting a ton of pressure on cod from all different angles. So it maybe in hindsight isn't so surprising that fishery sort of collapsed, where there's not many cod left at some points. Yeah. But copepods certainly play a role in that, because baby fish, one of their favorite things to eat are copepods. They're small, nutrient dense food items. So small fish will go after them and eat them. There are some parasites, copepods, that are parasites of cod, but they are not that harmful. So the parasites wouldn't have something to do with their decline.
Yeah, and I think we also destroyed their like habitat from
bottom trolling and stuff.
We hit them from all angles. It was a bit of a mess. Trulia wants to know, how long do isopods live for?
That's a good question. I don't know how long those big isopods, I mean, the parasitic ones, live for. I would guess probably a few years, because they start very small, but they can grow pretty large. So at least a few years. Some of the deep sea isopods that can get really big, you might have seen some pictures on the internet. They're called like, I think Bathynomus is like the giant ones. And I think the species name is like Giganteus or something like that. Right. Appropriate name. They grow like this big, and they're living in the deep sea where things tend to move slowly and grow slowly. So those can probably live for a while. I don't know offhand, but it wouldn't surprise me if you told me that could live for, 50 years or so.
Yeah, I'm vaguely recalling some aquarium in Japan tried to keep a giant isopod, and it I want to say it didn't eat for 15 years and it was still alive.
Wow.
It was either 5 or 15. I know that there's an octopus that didn't eat for 4.5 years, brooding her eggs. So it wouldn't shock me. So I think those deep sea isopods live a long time.
Yeah.
But don't write that in your lab report. Fact check that.
Yeah.
But I think that is ringing a bell. I think you can keep them alive even in captivity for a while.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question. Why is it called an isopod? And this person spelled isopod ICEOPOD. So they go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not positive about this. I could tell you why they're called a copepod. I suspect they're called.
That was also a question in this.
Okay. One. I suspect an isopod is called iso. Like iso often means like same, if you think of like an isosceles triangle. And isopods, that would mean same leg. And actually, their legs are very similar down their whole body. So I am just taking a guess at it, a slightly educated guess. So I don't know if that's exactly where it came from, but that would be my guess, because most crustaceans, their legs kind of differ along their body. Like crabs can have claws in the front, shrimp can have tails or swimming legs in the back, but isopods tend to have similar legs. They do also have things in the back that they can swim with, but that's my guess. I admit I do not know.
Great guess. Sounds good to me. And it's not isopod like cold water ice. So they live all over the place, hot, cold, whatever. Right. They live all over the place.
So copepod, though, that one I do know. I would have been very embarrassed if I couldn't answer that question. Copepod, copa or cope is a Greek word for oar. And then pod means like legs or feet. And so copepods have small paddle-shaped feet. And so they were named oarfoot. What's really cool is one of the unique things about copepods is that their left and right legs, they have like 5 pairs of these, are linked in the middle by a bar. And so they can't exactly do this so well because there's a hard part linking their legs. So their legs are actually very synchronized when they swim. And I sometimes wonder if that's part of the reason they got the name oarfoot, because when they swim, it's almost like somebody rowing with oars. I'm partly making this up, but I think it's a good story that possibly that may have also inspired the name oarfoot, or it could just be their paddle-shaped feet. That was certainly part of it. I like to think the rowing oar was also part of the story.
Sounds good. Brandon wants to know, I've heard that the blood-sucking parasites inside of shrimp are really harming shrimp populations and leading to their extinction. Is this true, or will shrimp be okay?
I am not sure about the specifics of that. My guess is in natural populations, they are probably not that problematic. They will be problematic. They will be problematic for the individual shrimp that has it growing on there.
Yeah.
But, you know, if they're only on 1% of shrimp, the rest of the shrimp population is doing fine. However, a lot of parasites can be problematic in artificial environments. So maybe a shrimp farm could have a bigger issue because they put a lot of shrimp together in a small area. If a parasite gets in there, it's like jackpot, all of the hosts that my babies and grandbabies could ever need. And so then they can build up in really high numbers in these artificial environments. Whereas in natural environments, there's more interactions. There'll be predators and other things that might feed on the parasites too. And so parasites are generally not harmful to an animal's population in nature, but in human impacted systems, they can be.
Awesome. Let's see. Could you tell us what generally copepods eat?
Yeah, so they eat a few different things. The free living ones tend to eat, kind of filter out small, like single-celled algae, diatoms, things like that. And they have special feathery legs for filtering those things. There are also a lot of copepods that are specialized predators of those filter feeding copepods. They will hunt them down with more like claw-like appendages and grab them and eat them. And then the parasites eat their hosts, and that could be almost anything. There are copepods that are on fish that drink fish blood or eat fish mucus. There are ones that live on whales. There are ones that eat coral mucus. There are ones that eat the inside of tunicates. So basically any animal in the ocean is probably food for a copepod. Although I should mention, animals that go on land don't get copepods. There are no parasitic copepods of humans. They really need to be on animals that are in water all the time.
Right. Awesome. Thanks. Our next question is, are there any other SpongeBob characters that you study in real life?
Well, I know Sarah, Squidward, that's a great one.
Yep.
I happen to know that a new species was described last year that was named after Patrick from SpongeBob. It's a starfish or a sea star. And they named it, the species name is Patrick Eye, meaning Patrick's sea star. And the reason they named it is it's a deep sea star. And every time they found it, it was attached to a sponge. And so they named it after Patrick because, Patrick and SpongeBob are always together. And this starfish seemed to always be with a deep sea sponge.
That's really cute.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I love that. And related to Patrick, Mrs. Tobin's 5th grade class asks, can starfish regrow their legs?
Most of them can. So that if they get a leg cut off, they can regrow it. Sometimes they will make a mistake and regrow too. But most starfish can regrow a leg, and some, as long as they have part of their mouth that's in the middle, some of them can even regrow many legs at a time. But it's not usually like you can't cut off each leg and have each one grow into a starfish, at least not in most starfish.
Very cool. Let's see. There are so many questions left, but I'm trying to, it's like hard to pick which one. Okay, so one of the questions is that the class is learning about the submersibles that we use in science. Have you ever been in a submersible?
No, I haven't. And that's definitely one of my dreams.
Yeah.
I worked for a summer or for a few weeks at Woods Hole, which I'm guessing, Sarah, you probably are very familiar with.
Yeah, I worked there
And
for a
so
semester.
I've seen some of these submarines or been at the location where some of these deep sea submarines like Alvin would come from. But I have not been in one. I would love to be in one. I don't know how much chance I will have because more and more these days, the really deep sea stuff is looked at with robots. So they're called ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. They're kind of like underwater drones. And that it's really hard for it to get a person down there. It's much easier to get a robot down there. It'll have robotic arms and somebody at the surface is controlling it and picking up cool deep sea things to bring up for scientists to study.
Very cool. So I think our last question from the audience, since we're at our 40-minute mark here, could you tell us exactly what your job is at the Smithsonian?
Yeah, good question. Well, like a lot of people these days, I'm working from home. So I sit at this computer desk that I'm talking to you from. But I got funding from the National Science Foundation to work for about 3 years building a copepod tree of life. So I'm collecting copepods from all over the world, and I'm sequencing their DNA to build this big copepod tree of life. So many different groups of copepods look so different from each other. We really have nothing to compare them to, and we're not sure how they evolved. So we sequence their DNA to try to figure that out. In practical terms, that means I work at a computer most of the day. I do I do a lot of computational biology. And I also work at a microscope a lot. I don't have a microscope. I have a dissecting microscope, but not like a high powered one in my apartment. So I can't do a lot of that work now. But yeah, you could usually find me either working at a computer or a microscope, and maybe once a year out in the field working, on the ocean somewhere, collecting cool stuff to bring back that I might then study for a year or 2 or 3 or even longer.
Awesome. All right. So we always ask people the same couple questions at the end of every session. The first is, you have the attention of the whole world in a hypothetical situation, and you can tell them one thing about your area of expertise. What is it?
Ooh, I would say animals or interesting life is all around us. You don't have to go to a rainforest or a coral reef to find cool things. A city park, a concrete piece of concrete that you flip over, even the things we call weeds that are growing between sidewalk are all doing amazing things. So take the time to notice some of the small things, because if you do, you'll be amazed by them.
That is really good advice, and a thing that I live by every day. I was flipping rocks yesterday in South Jersey. It was great.
Yeah.
And then the last question is, you still have everybody's attention in the whole world, and you can tell them that one thing about literally anything. It can be as big picture important or small and insignificant, but important to you as you'd like.
I think the one thing I would like to share is be curious. Curiosity is the most important thing in science. It's not grades, although you should try to get good grades. That will help you. It's not intelligence or how much you know. It is really curiosity. If you want to be a researcher or a scientist, you should bring your curiosity with you and stay excited about learning new things. I think that's the most important part of being a scientist. A lot of times in school, we have to memorize a lot of things because there's so much that we need to know so we can build upon that. But a scientist working day to day is usually not memorizing things so much anymore, but they're asking questions and trying to find out how can we answer those questions. And that's really all curiosity based. And so keep asking questions, stay curious.
Awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, things you'd like to plug, places we can find you on social media before we wrap up?
Sure. Yeah. I'd love if people are interested, if they want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Jimmy Bernot, just my name, JIMMYBERNOT. I'll usually be posting things about, sea creatures, invertebrates, parasites. I've been meaning to make a TikTok for a long time, and I keep putting it off. So, but maybe one day I'll be on there too. I think I got Jimmy Bernot as a name on there, but I haven't shared anything.
Yeah. I'll be posting more on TikTok once the weather, well, starting now, basically.
Yeah.
Because in the winter, I just couldn't get any good animal content. It was too cold.
Yeah.
But I have a TikTok too at Sarah Mac Attack. All social medias, same thing. So if you want to see little critters, I got them on there. Awesome. Anything else you'd like to plug?
No, I think that is about it. I mean, Skype a Scientist, I love you. I've had so much fun doing these. I found myself kind of doing more this year because I'm a little isolated at home, and it's just nice to be able to talk to people. And I've had so much fun talking to so many different classes all across the country.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And thanks everybody for listening and for your excellent questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us. This was super fun. Everybody at home, housekeeping wise, we do these sessions about once a week. A lot of you came today, which is so amazing. And I want to make sure you know that even if your question wasn't answered today, that's not because your question wasn't awesome. It's just we had a lot of people here and a lot of different people asking questions. And so if you have more questions, you can find a lot of marine scientists on Twitter, on Instagram, on other places, and you can feel free to ask folks there. We also have a lot of sessions coming up. You can check that out at skypeascientist.com and then click the events tab. Other than that, you can support Skype a Scientist. We always need support from folks at home at patreon.com/Skype a Scientist. We also do trivia nights for the adults every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. It's super fun. You learn lots of animal facts and get to hang out with some science dorks. So that's a good time. Other than that, that's really all I have to say for now. Thank you again, Jimmy, for joining us, and Erin, thank you for signing. You are our rock.
I was about to say the same thing. Erin, thank you for helping us reach a broader audience. And Sarah, thanks for making this so easy for me, managing all the questions. I'm not jealous of that job because I'm sure it's a hard one, but you made it really easy on me. So thank you both.
Good. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, everybody, we'll see you next time. Thank you for coming. Bye.